All right, let's do this thing. Hello, hello, hello. Mic check, 1, 2. Can you hear me? Wow, look at all the people that we have here today. I'm happy that so many people are interested in what a watershed is and the health of our watershed. Thank you for coming to Leo's Community Development Center. We've got a bunch of events going on. You're going to hear from Garland today from the Water Resource Research Center out of U of A. He's a master's student. He's involved in the Watershed Working Group, which is doing projects here that are going to support our watershed. I want to quickly let you know we've got a bunch of events happening. We've got karaoke night tomorrow night, 6 p.m. If you want to come here, it's going to be a different vibe. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then on Friday, we got U of A coming at 1 p.m. for Science Fridays. This is where you can come to do some lead testing. That's what we're going to be doing on Friday. And then we got a concert happening on Saturday. That's going to be also at 6 p.m. So lots of stuff happening this week. We've got a packed schedule for December. We're already starting to schedule out January. So we're going to have some good speakers coming. We're happy that Garland made his trek all the way from Tucson. You came here? Dang. So thank you for doing that. We appreciate it. We're going to hear from you. And let's give a round of applause for Garland. Thank you. You.
I guess you probably hold that till the end and after you hear my presentation. Right? So, I want to express my gratitude for y'all inviting me in here to speak today. And I also want to be clear that even though I do work for the Water Resources Research Center, I'm out here on my own, so any mistakes in this presentation or any incorrect information that I might state here, that's all me. That's not the Water Resources Research Center or the Queen Creek Working Group. All right, do you mind going to the next slide, please? So I'm here to kind of talk to you guys about what a watershed is, and my real goal coming out of this is that we build on some common terms and establish some common grounds. Things you guys will probably be hearing a lot about is we continue to develop as a watershed group. And so I want to kind of preface this by saying that I'm going to be talking about a lot of general knowledge and general principles that are generally applicable throughout the world. But knowledge is really local, and so that's what the Queen Creek Working Group and the Cooperative Watershed Management Program through Reclamation really are designed on, is documenting local knowledge and conditions and developing those types of plans based off of that. So kind of starting out here, we'll look at what is a watershed. And so a watershed is an area of land that collects and channels precipitation, so like rain and snow melt, to creeks, streams, and rivers to a single outlet point. And so on this diagram here, we've got the four big elements of a watershed from a geographic perspective. There's the hill slopes, so that's kind of like the flat areas on the sides of hills or the flat bottoms of valleys. It's where precipitation tends to strike. It'll accumulate, pond up. Eventually, those ponds will meet together and will start to flow overland. As it flows overland, it accumulates in channels. And those channels join together, eventually leading to a single outlet from an area. And so the last element here is the boundary. And so that's one of the real pickles when you're defining a watershed, is how you define that boundary. So in a lot of watershed management problems, we define it with hydrological unit codes and define it from the elevation of an area, looking at surface flows and how water actually flows over the land. A lot of times people will do things like extend the boundaries artificially to maintain continuous planning over certain projects. Like I know a bunch of ranchers down in southeastern Arizona developed a watershed boundary based on hydrological principles and then extended it out to make sure that the ranches were continuously managed across the watershed. Next slide, please. And so as we start talking about watershed management, there's a few key terms that get thrown around here. I want to make sure that you guys have an understanding and appreciation of what these mean. So watershed management, you guys will hear that a lot. So basically that's organizing and planning land and resource use on a watershed basis. So the real key thing about this, right, is you guys have all worked with different agencies over the past. You know that they have different overlapping boundaries. Like within this region itself, we have the Forest Service, we have BLM, we have private property owners. And so there's different approaches to managing across all those organizations. And so by defining your planning boundary as the watershed boundary, you're really incorporating the physical processes and developing your plans and your use strategies based on what's physically happening in your environment, not sort of arbitrary man-made boundaries. And so a big thing coming out of watershed management is it's about focusing on providing those desired goods and services that you want, you know, maintaining your economy, developing food sources, doing agriculture, all those sorts of things, but doing it in a manner that maintains soil, water, and natural resource sustainability and health. So there's a few different flavors of watershed management that get thrown around. You'll hear this a lot. Integrated watershed management's a pretty big one. And so the real big thing on that is that it involves all the stakeholders within a watershed, and it considers those like food, water, energy nexuses, so that you're addressing things in a holistic manner. You're considering how changes affect each other and how resources interplay with each other. A big focus on integrated watershed management is developing and implementing watershed plans. And so that's a guiding document that helps make sure that you're doing these things. You're considering all stakeholders. It's a somewhat formalized and rigorous process for developing these types of strategies. And the big focus here is that solutions that you develop must be environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable. And then in the past 15, 20 years, an emerging concept in management is adaptive management. And so this is really a structured approach to making decisions under substantial uncertainty. A classic example of this is considering climate change effects. So I think we all know that in the Southwest we expect to see the impacts of climate change a bit more severely than other regions of the country. We're expecting to see greater temperature increases than other regions, and our precipitation down here is likely to become more variable, meaning that we're going to have larger magnitude flooding or storm events, but they're also going to be a bit more infrequent and likely to be an overall decrease in the amount of precipitation that we receive. And so since we know these general trends of what are going to be happening, but we don't know exactly how they're going to be realized. We don't know exactly what levels of temperature rise we're going to see. We don't know how much the precipitation patterns are going to change. And so what you can do with adaptive management is create triggers and actions. So, if you have a year where you don't receive any rain, you implement certain conservation actions to make sure that you maintain the amount of water that you need in the watershed. Next slide, please. Okay, so now as we start thinking more deeply about watershed functions and what types of goods and services we want to get out of a watershed, an emerging paradigm since about the early 2000s has been the description of ecosystem services. So this is a way to describe the benefits that people receive from the environment that aren't necessarily easily monetizable. So it's not like timber, necessarily just timber production, but it's all the other things. And these are grouped into 4 categories. So there's provisioning, so like the development of food sources. There's water provisioning, like how water flows through a watershed, and there's things like plants have inputs to industrial processes and pharmaceuticals. There's hydropower. Another category of ecosystem services is regulating. And so there's things like carbon sequestration, the carbon cycle going into the soil. There's climate regulation, how forests help maintain temperatures and humidity in regions. There's waste decomposition cycles, both aquatic and terrestrial. And then there's all the water and air purification benefits you get from things like forests, purify the air, and they also limit the amount of dust and air pollution that gets kicked up. Wetlands provide a great water purification function. And so there's all those benefits you get from there as well. There's supporting functions. So there's the nutrient cycle through nature, how phosphorus, carbon, and nitrogen work through the system to develop the food and habitat that we all enjoy. There's the soil creation cycle and how that develops over time. We'll talk more about that later. And then there's also the water cycle, which regulates water through our systems. And then finally, there's the cultural sort of values. These tend to be a little bit more controversial and difficult to work around. Some of those other values, they can be easier to monetize because it's a little bit easier to analyze and say, you know, like what water quality treatment benefits you get out of a wetland is compared to how much a sunset is worth to me, right? Or how much a beautiful vista is worth. And it gets even more complicated as you start considering like traditional uses, cultural values, and spiritual natures. A lot of those things people even decry the attempt at monetization, and that can cause a lot of controversy. But it is a very important category of services to consider. And so watersheds, they're composed and support ecosystems, right? So that's all a watershed is it's the physical boundary describing how water moves through and supports ecosystems. And so providing these ecosystem services, that's the function of a watershed. That's what it does for us. Next slide, please. And so the next big concept I'd like to talk about here is the water cycle. I think we all learned about this in grade school. I know I sure did. And then as you get older, they complicate it and call it the hydrological cycle. But basically, it describes the process by which water goes from the ocean into the atmosphere, comes down over the land, transits through the environments, and flows back to the ocean. So this diagram here is a decently complete water cycle, but we can make a lot of simplifications based on the environment that we're in, the semi-arid region we're at, and we can kind of simplify that down to a water budget that describes how water flows through our region. And so just like a budget, it's basically a checkbook. You total up what you're getting in, and subtract out what you're getting out, and that's how much you have left. So inputs into a watershed. The obvious one and the big one is precipitation, right? So rainstorms, snow melt comes through. That's where a lot of the region gets most of their water from. Q in, so scientists like to use Q to describe volume flow, volumetric flow of water a lot. So a lot of times if you see the letter Q, that's what it means. So Q in here just means the water flowing into the watershed. So like in Queen Valley down there, you know, Queen Creek flows through there sometimes, so that's water going in on the surface. But then groundwater also moves. It moves with gravity and capillary action, so groundwater can come into the area. As far as things going out, there's ET, which is evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is a $6 word for saying it's the evaporation of water out of your area, and it's the water that plants use as well. So evaporation is just, it comes out of the soil, it comes out of reservoirs, it evaporates out of streams. So, and then transpiration is plants do photosynthesis and then respire at night. They also take water out of the soil and respire it into the air. And so those are difficult to measure separately, so scientists generally group them together into evapotranspiration, and that's all that means. Q out is just the water flowing out of the watershed via surface flows and groundwater flow. And then S would just be the change in storage, right? So if you have a really dry year where you're pumping a lot of groundwater and you're not getting a lot of precipitation in, you're likely to be decreasing your storage. Similarly, if you have a really wet year, you're not pumping a lot of groundwater, you're increasing storage. People like to obfuscate this a lot, but it's a pretty simple concept, especially in our region where we don't have a lot of these complicating factors to worry about. Next slide, please. So kind of taking another look at the water balance and how water flows through a system and how overland and stream flow are generated. This is a nice little diagram that kind of illustrates a lot of that in a cross-section view of the land. So imagine that down here you've got a stream flowing out of the monitor at us. So that's how we're looking at the system here. So you get rainfall coming into the region. So that's some of your inputs. And then you have all the plants evapotranspirating out. So as water falls on the land, it's going to interact with the soil, and it's going to percolate down into the soil. Eventually the soil is going to reach capacity, or water's going to be falling too fast for it to percolate down into the soil, and it's going to start accumulating on the surface. Once enough water accumulates on the surface, it's going to start running down together, turning into rivulets, then streams and channels. And so that's what we're showing here is that overland flow. So the other dynamics you have here is you have the water that's infiltrating into the ground, and that shallow surface layer of soil, you're going to get more rapid water movement subsurface. And then as you go deeper and deeper into the deep aquifer storage and bedrock, that's where those water velocities slow down a lot, and that's where you get your groundwater storage and long-term effects. The other cool thing that we're showing in here, so you have that saturated zone where you have the like subsurface flow that's at a higher velocity than the deep flow. You can see the water table here, and what they're showing here is that if you cut a road and it goes down below the water table, water's going to bubble up out of the side of the road and flow down the road. Similarly, down here in the stream, if the stream bed elevation rises, dips below the water table elevation, groundwater is going to come out into the stream bed and flow. If the water table is below the stream bed elevation, water is going to percolate down through the stream bed and recharge that aquifer. And so, respectively, if the groundwater is going into the stream, that's called a gaining reach of a stream. If groundwater is going from the stream if water is going from the stream into the ground, that's called a losing reach. You'll hear those terms thrown around a lot. And so that's also part of the reason why in Arizona, right, you hear a lot of talk about groundwater and groundwater levels, because almost all of our perennial streams, especially in the southern half of the state, the reason they're perennial is because of that groundwater. We don't get enough rainfall and snowfall down here to provide that type of year-round flow. Next slide, please. All right, so now as we start talking about some of these different factors that influence how water and watersheds function. So precipitation, that's a pretty big input into the system, right? So there's 4 big variables about rain that really impact, that have like trickle through how water flows through the watershed. So there's the intensity of a storm, right? So that's like how much water is falling out of the sky per hour. A lot of times you'll see it in inches per hour or millimeters per hour, depending on who's doing the work. There's duration, so how long the storm lasts. So is it an hour-long storm, a 20-minute storm? There's the raindrop side and raindrop speed, right? And so those both kind of affect the velocity of the raindrops as they strike the ground, and they also affect the behavior of rain over the surface and how some of those erosion properties work. We'll get into more detail on that in a little bit. And so all of this plays into interception, infiltration, runoff, and erosion, right? Those are the 4 big things here. So interception, that's, so precipitation falls out of the sky, it starts landing on plants, that's what we call interception. So the water that lands on the plants, it'll either be used by the plants, so transpired out, it'll evaporate away, so evapotranspiration there, right? The other thing that can happen is it can run down the stems and go down onto the ground and flow out. So that's not why we don't really talk about it in our water budget there, because it's a temporary storage that happens internal to the system that we're describing, right? So it either evapotranspirates away or turns into runoff, so it's captured in either of those 2 terms of that water budget. So infiltration, oh sorry.
All right.
No worries.
Jump ahead.
Yeah, so infiltration, that's how water percolates down into the soil. That depends on a lot of different properties of the soil's ability to accept water, how much water was already in the soil to begin with, the soil structure. And I'll talk more about soil properties that are important to a watershed soon. So runoff, the water that isn't intercepted or infiltrated, it will accumulate, pond up, and flow. And so you can see how storm intensity would play into that in storm duration, because if there's a lot more rain coming down in a short period, it's not going to be able to percolate in as well. It's going to turn into runoff more quickly. That makes sense? And then finally, erosion. Erosion is just the transfer, in our region, there's wind erosion and stuff like that, but since we're talking about a watershed, we're going to focus mostly on transportation of soil by rainwater. Next slide, please. So soil has a lot of really important functions in a watershed. So it regulates water by helping to control where it flows and how it flows, right? So there's the three big factors you'll hear soil scientists talk about and watershed managers talk about as they go through this. That's soil texture. So that's the composition of the soil, the amount of sand, clay, and loam that you have. So those are just the different particle sizes that make up, or inorganic particle sizes that make up the soil. Sand being the largest, loam being medium-sized, and then clay being really fine particles. And so how all those different particles interact together and how they stick together and everything, that really affects water's ability to flow through it. Finer soil is going to be harder for water to flow through because there's less space there and there's more stuff for it to resist the water's flow. Soil structure, so that's the arrangement of soil particles and how it creates pore spaces and flow paths, right? So, there's little tiny holes in soil. It's not like perfectly dense. That's where water flows through and goes through. And so there's lots of different soil structures. Like you think about the soil you see in the Mississippi Valley, that really rich, black soil that's like pretty loose, water goes through it pretty easily. And then you think about like some of the cracked earth that you see around here and how it's really column there. And the only place for water to really flow is down through those cracks, so it doesn't flow through as quickly. You're more likely to get runoff from that structure than from a finer structure. Make sense? So in our region, well, across the world, but especially in semi-arid regions like we have down here, due to the low amount of water and due to the low amount of biological growth compared to the Midwest, it can take hundreds or thousands of years for soil to accumulate and for soil to form. Another big factor for soil is the storage, transformation, and cycling of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, right? Soil provides spaces for nitrogen-fixing bacteria to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, put it in the soil where it's available for plants to grow. It does the same thing with the help of plants. It stores carbon and organic matter in the soil. Carbon sequestration is really important for combating global warming. And so that's another critical function of soil. Obviously provides a support structure for plants to grow in, for their roots to take hold. And soil is really profoundly impacted by erosion. That's one of the biggest watershed concerns in our region, across the state typically. Next slide, please. So erosion. I think we all know what it is, but the way scientists like to talk about it is it's the detachment, movement, and deposition of soil by water, wind, ice, or gravity. For our discussions, we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be focusing on water because even though wind's happening a lot, water has so much more mass and momentum behind it as it flows through a region that you'll get the same amount of erosion from one big runoff event that you can get from like hundreds of years of air erosion, right? So other terms you hear thrown around a lot as part of erosion is sediment. So sediment is just the inorganic and organic material, including things like soil, like big rocks, litter, like plant debris that sits on the surface of the earth, all of that stuff that gets transported by water. If it's in active transport or if it's been deposited someplace where it didn't originally reside, that's what we call sediment. And then sediment yield is just simply the quantity of sediment being transported over a unit time. So in the Midwest, where they have all that farmland that's not been managed super great, you'll hear that people are losing hundreds of tons of soil per acre per year. That's a common unit here. And so that's just something you'll hear a lot and something to be sensitive to. And so how does erosion impact the watershed functions, right? So of course there's the soil productivity. So in semi-arid regions, this is just a general rule of thumb, the top inch of a soil, of our ground, that's where all the nutrients really reside. That's where the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are at. So that's, once that gets stripped away, it's going to take hundreds to thousands of years for that to reform through natural processes. Otherwise, you're doing really intensive soil rehabilitation efforts that take a lot of manpower and money to implement. And then, so as erosion happens, the finer particles, those smaller particles, those are the ones that are most likely to get picked up first. That makes sense, right? Like if you're blowing air over a handful of dust, the finer stuff goes first, and the bigger particles remain behind. So the same thing happens with soil. So the silts, the clays, the loams, all of that's going to get picked up and transported away first, leaving behind sandy soil that really changes the properties and behaviors of soil for its watershed functions of channeling water. As erosion occurs, like bigger and larger scale erosion occurs, you can start seeing the sediment infills of channels and ponds. So, like they dredge the rivers out east. And what tends to be more applicable out here is you have not lots of nice little pools and areas that tend to hold water longer than the stream after the stream dries out. Well, as those get filled in, you lose that aquatic habitat and you lose that reservoir for water. So that's another reason to really be concerned about managing erosion. Lots of erosion is going to increase your water treatment costs, especially if you're relying on surface water, because you have to clean out all those particles from the water to make sure that it's drinkable. But then, like down here in the non-point pollution discussion, that those particles and that soil also like captures a lot of nutrients. So like out in the Midwest where they do a lot of really heavy chemical fertilizer use, as that water runs off, it carries that like artificial nitrogen and phosphates, carries it into the river, and that goes downstream. And so that's why there's a giant dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico outside of the Mississippi River. It's not because they're using the chemical fertilizers, but because erosion carries those chemical fertilizers to the sea. And then finally, there's the potential for physical damage to property and infrastructure. So as soil sweeps away, we've all seen pictures of landslides in California, taking out roads, taking out power lines, destroying buildings. These are all things that can happen and why erosion is a chief concern for watershed function. Next slide, please. So there's different erosion processes too. So the first step in erosion starting to occur is what we call splash erosion. So as a drop of water strikes the ground, it rebounds like this, and you can see in this picture here, there's little particles of soil that have been picked up by that water. So the big thing that plays in here is the size of the water droplet and the speed of that water droplet. So the heavier the water, the faster that raindrop is going, the more splash erosion you're going to get, right? It makes sense. If you throw a rock into a water, you see it splashes up more if it's a bigger and heavier rock moving faster. Next slide, please. So as you start getting splash erosion building up, you start to develop little channels, right? So the water accumulates like we talked about, it ponds and channels and moves down. And so that's when you'll start getting what's called sheet flow erosion. So I think we've all probably been out in the desert in a rainstorm and see how water moves in a sheet over the land. And so as it's carrying that soil with it, you can start to see in this picture how it's moving some of that soil along in a really shallow way. So splash erosion accumulates and builds up, and then you start getting sheet flow erosion. Next slide, please. So along the side of this hill slope here is what's called rill erosion. So as sheet flow erosion builds up, as you start getting sheets concentrating down into each other, it's going to start moving material out of an area and sizing a channel, creating a little riverbed essentially. So rill erosion tends to be pretty shallow. It's early on in the process, and the difference between rill and gully erosion is that rills are shallow enough that it could be corrected through a single application of plowing. It's not a real firm definition. Next slide, please. And so then you've got gully erosion. So as rills continue to be uncorrected, they eventually deepen after each runoff event, and you get really deep gullies. So this is out in the Santa Teresa Mountains. There's a little logging road out there, and this road has a 20-foot deep gully right next to it. And so you can see how, if that starts cutting over to the side, it's going to go under the road's going to collapse down in there, and it really highlights some of the risks that you face from erosion. Next slide, please. And so this slide So depending on who you're talking to, if you're talking to like irrigated agriculture sort of people, they're going to refer to sheet flow, rill, and gully erosions. If you guys are talking to ranchers, they're probably going to be talking about inner rill erosion. So this diagram just kind of illustrates how it would occur along a stream bank where you get some raindrop erosions leading to sheets, creating rill and gully erosion, which then leads to channel erosion. And that's what you see in the major channels and along major rivers, where there's those really steep walls, where you see walls of earth falling in. That's the gully and channel erosion. Yeah, and so that sheet erosion and rain splash erosion, like I said, ranchers like to call that inner rill. Then there's the rill erosion and gully erosion, and this is a neat example from Desprats et al. Showing the kind of progression that you get through a region. All right, so vegetation, so plant life, has a really big impact on watershed function, right? So it provides a protective canopy and mat of litter. So when we're talking about litter here, we're talking about organic litter. So, you know, like leaves, twigs, pollen, all that sort of stuff that falls out and forms a layer over the surface. And so what the canopy and that litter does is, like, when the raindrops are falling out of the sky, it's going to strike the canopy, it's going to strike the litter, and you're not going to see splash erosion because it's not directly impacting the soil, it's not going to be carried away. And having that surface layer and having good vegetation with like lots of, like having grassy areas with lots of stalks, that also slows the flow of water over the land, because as water's flowing and hits a stalk or hits that litter, it changes direction and slows down a little bit. Similarly, as you have plants going into a region, you know, the surface of the earth gets a little bit rougher, right? The roots start to break things up, and you're more likely to see less smooth surfaces. That also decreases the runoff speeds, which improves the overall watershed function. Roots hold soil in place. I think that's pretty obvious. We've all seen probably, you know, like chunks of grass with deep erosion around them, and it's really showing you how that root structure is really holding the soil together there. Beyond that, they create favorable soil structures. Like, you know, we were talking about, like, you know, that kind of platy or columnar structure. Well, roots break that up, creating a more favorable structure that increases infiltration into a region. Plants deposit organic matter in soils, improving soil structure and water retention capacity. It also, if you have more plants in a region, it increases the amount of interception that occurs, and it also increases the transpiration out of the plants. That means there's less antecedent soil moisture, so that means that there's less water there to begin with, so there's more room for the water to percolate down into the soil before it starts running off overland. And then there's just all the other values that vegetation gives, like air quality, you know, like, I think we've all seen a windstorm blow through like a fallowed agricultural field with nothing on it versus seeing a windstorm blow through a field that's in production, right? It's pretty obvious the difference there. Provides forage and habitat for humans and for non-human animals. And it also provides a lot of aesthetics, right? We all like to see vegetation and greenery. So here we're kind of illustrating in this figure kind of how it works. So you have the inner rill cover area, right? And so you can imagine as the water falls out of the sky, it's going to strike here. It's going to flow a lot more slowly through these types of areas versus the rill interspace area where it can just strike the soil without resistance and without having to change direction. And here's a cool study from back in the 60s where some people set up a test on, with the same slope and same soil properties with just different levels of vegetation and litter covering the ground. And you can see where you just have 60 to 75% of the ground covered with plants and litter, you're only getting 2% of the rainfall coming through as runoff, right? But if you change it down to 37%, 14% of that rainfall is coming through as runoff. So you're getting really big changes from just really small changes to the vegetation structure. Next slide, please. So another big impact on, and another big concern as climate change worsens is fire, right? I mean, as temperatures increase, precipitation decreases, invasive species move in, we're gonna change the types and amounts of fire that we have. Drier fires followed by, or drier seasons followed by immense wet periods means you get a lot of really quick invasive growth, or you get some perennial growth. And then if we follow that up with a dry period, you have a lot of fuel there to burn, and so you're more likely to start seeing increased risk and severity of wildfires. And so the fire impact really depends on the fire, and the fire impact on the watershed really depends on the fire intensity. A lot of ecosystems like savannas and grasslands are pretty well fire adapted. A lot of rangeland in the region, we're dealing with mesquite encroachment a lot, where mesquites are spreading their natural range out from where they normally are. And that's because we've interrupted some of the natural fire regimes in the region. So if you have a grassland and a bunch of small mesquites starting to crop up, every 6 to 10 years historically, you'd have a small, relatively low intensity fire roll through those grasslands that would burn away all those little shrubby mesquites and allow the grass to get reestablished. Since we've interrupted those natural fire regimes, now the mesquite has more time to grow, it gets to be bigger and bigger, it takes more water out of the soil, starts killing off the grass, and that's how you end up with mesquite encroachment and the changeover of land. Right? And so the other kind of tricky side effect that you don't really think about is that changeover is that all the other things being equal, mesquite use a lot more water than grassland. So not only are you decreasing kind of the beneficial flow properties, like the surface breakup that you get from the density of grass in the region by just having shrubs and trees, you're also evapotranspirating much more water out of the area. And mesquite actually, as you go from grassland to mesquite conversion, the general trend is you see groundwater levels decline because the mesquite are taking up so much more water than the grass used to. So low intensity fires, they can be fairly beneficial to regions. But as I was talking about, like you change vegetative communities, or you have like a really dry pine forest and you get a fire strike, yeah, that's going to be a high intensity fire that things aren't necessarily adapted to. Or like, let's say you get buffalo grass in a region instead of our historic communities like Saskatoon grass. Buffalo grass burns a lot hotter, so it's going to have a different fire regime. And so as you get those high intensity fires, you're going to cause vegetation damage and death, and the destruction of that surface material and litter that really helps to slow up the runoff flow over the land. The other big thing, and that is like really fascinating and pretty scary, is you actually modify the soil if you have a high intensity fire. Is you bake the water out of the soil and you change how dense it is because it starts to compact and settle down. That decreases the porosity, and that means that water is going to infiltrate that region more slowly. The other really weird thing you can get out of an intense fire is it will actually change the surface properties of that surface layer of soil, creating a hydrophobic crust, meaning that it won't let any water through at all. I think we've all seen videos or even seen firsthand after a fire and a big rainstorm, that giant flash flood that comes through a region with all that debris and stuff. Part of that is because they create that hydrophobic crust and the water just can't penetrate at all, so it's just going to go straight over the soil and into the river. Next slide, please. So land use, as you expect, this is where we start getting into some of the human impacts of how we change how watersheds work. Land cover changes, so I talked about mesquite encroachment a little bit last, but then there's also things like urbanization, which really affects permeability and runoff. So here's a figure from Schuler in 1987, kind of showing how a water balance would change pre-development to post-development. And so you can see that the size of the arrows change between figures, and what they're trying to do there is show that, hey, in a more kind of naturalistic state, you have runoff, interflow, groundwater flow, interception, all these things sort of balance out. As you start changing the land surface, you start doing development, building roads, putting houses in, putting a lot of pavement in, that changes how water flows through a region. So you're going to see a lot more surface runoff, less evapotranspiration, and less interflow and base flow. Other management practices that happen a lot is, and this is part of why watershed management is important, and getting every stakeholder involved in making these decisions and understanding how they interplay together, right? So we're all talking about how we want to slow water down in the region, get it percolating into the groundwater so that we can encourage that conservation and encourage those healthy riparian areas. Well, if you start talking to a flood manager, they're really concerned with just getting water out of an area as quickly as they can and minimizing the property damage risk of floods. So flood managers, they're all about focusing on increasing runoff efficiency and channeling that excess flow out of the watershed as quickly as possible. That's why in places like Phoenix and Tucson, you see that they've armored the stream banks that have lots of concrete all over the place. That's because it allows the water to flow out really, really quickly and also contributes to the groundwater declines in the Tucson region. There's groundwater pumping that affects the gaining and losing reaches of stream as groundwater levels lower or raise. And then a lot of riparian species are also dependent on groundwater for maintenance. Depending on their stage of life, cottonwoods require, in the juvenile stages, they require water within, depending on what sources you're studying, a half a foot to a foot of the surface, and then full-grown cottonwoods require water within a meter of the surface. So as you start pumping down groundwater, you're going to reduce the availability of this long-term supply to a lot of these vegetative communities and really impact the ability for them to sustain themselves. And then as you bring invasive species into a region, whether it's through landscaping getting out of control, people introducing kudzu vine to try to stabilize regions, those have a profound impact on the water and fire cycles in the region as well. Next slide, please. And so here we've got a hydrograph kind of illustrating a general concept of what would happen is you change, is you implement some of those like development strategies and really change the runoff characteristics in a region. So all this graph does is show the stream flow rate, so how many like cubic feet per second are going through a stream at a particular location compared against time. And so what they've done is they've shown, hey, let's say you get a large storm here. If you have a really robust watershed with lots of good vegetation and ground cover, if you've done smart development like compensating for impermeable surfaces with catchment basements and water harvesting activities, you can get a real nice gradual curve, because that water is going to soak into the soil, gradually flow out. It's going to be slowed down by all those plants and everything else. And that's really what you want to see in a region. As you start changing those surface characteristics, as you pave over more surface, as you build more roads and compact things, you're going to change that and you're going to get peakier flows earlier on as well. So you can see that because the water isn't being retained in the soil, because the water isn't being slowed down by plants, it flows straight through and you get really flashy sort of flood events. Next slide, please. And so kind of, we've been through some of these larger concepts. I kind of want to give a little brief overview of some of the research we've been able to perform so far to provide some context into our specific area. There isn't a lot we can share yet, but we're really happy to take some of your questions and we can give you more information on things as we go through. So kind of considering where we're at within the larger system, right? Because that's what watersheds are about. It's about understanding how other users are affecting you, but also understanding your effects on other users, right? So I talked earlier about how we set watershed boundaries. The United States Geological Survey, so the USGS, they've come up with a system of set of boundaries that are typically used throughout the United States, and they're organized by hydrological unit codes. So, and those are given by a number of digits. So you hear people talk about like HUC 2, HUC 10, HUC 12. So the greater number of digits they're talking about, so a HUC 2 is going to be the largest watershed, a HUC 12 is going to be the smallest. And so it's just a way of describing those kind of interactions and how things are nested together and fit together. So kind of positioning the Upper Queen Creek within the context of the state and region. We're part of the Lower Colorado region, and so you can see it's out behind the label here, that little blue area is where we're going to be talking about. And so as we kind of zoom in, so next slide, please. So this is the HUC. So They say that you can use any combination, but I only ever see them in even numbers. So we're going to go 2, 4, 6, 8. So 2 is the lower Colorado region. And so as you get into the 4-digit codes, you start breaking the 2-digit entire Colorado region into the smaller sort of watersheds. And so you can see there's like the Little Colorado, the Lake Mead, the Sonora, and the Middle Gila and Upper Gila. So the Upper Gila flows into the Middle Gila, and we're part of the Middle Gila watershed. So as you zoom in again, next slide, you can see that they, again, so when we go from 4 to Hug 6, they start breaking it up even more. And now every Hug 4 doesn't end up with a Hug 6 necessarily. Like you can see the Little Colorado up here, because it's so flat up there and so planar, it doesn't really make sense to divide that any further. But down here in the Middle Gila, where you have like the Santa Cruz River and you have that San Pedro River system contributing to the Gila, it makes more sense to break those up. And so that's why they've broken it up here. You can see that we're part of the Middle Gila. Next slide, please. So as you continue to zoom in, you can see that, hey, in the Middle Gila, it didn't really make sense to give us an 8-digit code. But like down here in the Santa Cruz, it makes sense to break it up into Lower Santa Cruz, Brawley, and Upper Santa Cruz to describe the different ways and mountain ranges that are in the region that control how water flows. Next slide, please. And so then finally you get down to the Hug 10 level, and that's what we're planning on using as our basis for the watershed management plan we're trying to develop. And so you can see where we're located within the watershed. So the Upper Queen Creek's actually at the headwaters, and it feeds down into the Lower Queen Creek down there. Or it feeds into the Middle Queen Creek and then Lower Queen Creek. Next slide, please. And then as you get further in, you can see that they broke it down into the 12-digit codes. And so the 10-digit Upper Queen Creek watershed is composed of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Hug 12s. And so the reason that we ended up working and selecting this boundary is because we're really concerned with Queen Creek restoration, getting flows back in there and restoring those riparian areas. And so we want to reflect all the physical processes in the region and all the stakeholders that are going to have a say in that. So what we're showing here is up here at the very top, that's the headwaters of the Queen Creek, assuming that you're getting surface flow. You can see the flow direction going down through here. All these other little lighter blue and then slightly darker blue lines, those are all the channels and drainages in the region that flow in and fill into the Queen Creek. The lighter blue ones are intermittent, which means that the lighter blue ones are ephemeral, which means that they only flow in direct response to a rain event. The darker blue lines here are intermittent, which means there's going to be some periods where it's flowing without rain. There's going to be some periods where it doesn't. And then portions of the Queen Creek are still classified as perennial because it takes a long time to get through the process of updating that. And so perennial just means that it's flowing pretty much all the time. There's different rules of thumbs people throw around for that 80 to 90% of the time. It really depends. And so that's what you see here. This is where we're going to be focusing on planning, and you can see how it plays into the flows of Queen Creek here. Next slide, please. And so then the last thing I want to share here that we were able to find was the land cover. So this is a national land cover data set. It's publicly available, published through the United States Geological Survey again. And so what they do is they have these satellites that go overhead, and they periodically map on a 30 meter by 30 meter squares, so about 90 foot by 90 foot square. What they do is they take infrared readings of what light is emitted from the surface, and they're able to do some science and automatically convert that into what type of land cover is in a region. And so there's a lot of limitations to this, but it does provide some valuable trends. So some of the limitations here are it is remote sensing, so it's not based on like on-the-ground observation. It's a computer-generated process. The computer is the one that determines what land cover, a particular wavelength means. And so it doesn't really, it doesn't have that same effect of going out in the field and physically observing what's happening. And so that's how you can see these kind of categories come out. So there's like developed open space or developed low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity, those are just kind of describing the land cover characteristics, not necessarily the purpose of the land or the health of it, right? So like a medium density development could be a parking lot for a school, it could be like apartment complexes, or it could be any number of other things that just have that sort of like reflective property. So the good thing about this though is that they do update it fairly periodically. I think it's on a 5-year basis. And so what we can see here is on the left side here is what the land cover was in 2001, and then on the right side is the land cover in 2019. And so you can see, it's useful for trending and observing some of the changes that can occur without doing a lot of manpower intensive observations. So some of the stuff you might notice here is there's this large area of grassland that's since been converted into shrub or scrub, which is probably grasses being converted over to mesquite. But then up here along along the border to Randolph Canyon, you can see there's been some grassland reestablished and reclaimed from the mesquite shrub. You can see that the forest looks like it's becoming a little patchier through up in the Devil's Claw region. And then you can see, if you zoom in, you'd be able to see that there's a little bit more development occurring in the town of Superior area. You can see some of the roads that have been put in. Next slide, please. And so what we're doing here is I'm just calculating the percent change. So this isn't looking at like, hey, that big grassland area moved from kind of the Boyce-Thompson Arboretum area up to the northern edge of the watershed. It's just saying, hey, area per area, what is the composition in 2001 versus 2019? And so you can see the big hits here is that we've gone from about 1,000 to 500, so we've lost roughly half of the evergreen forest within the watershed. There's been some woody wetland conversions. And then there's also been some reclamation from barren land and rock. So this is really early on in the process of developing this data and characterizing the watershed, but these are the types of activities that we'll be performing as part of the Queen Creek Working Group to characterize the watershed and inform these plans. So next slide, please. So this is kind of the big opportunity for y'all to get involved, is the Queen Creek Working Group's working on putting in a Bureau of Reclamation, WaterSmart, Cooperative Watershed Management Program, Phase 1 grant. And so basically what that's gonna allow us to do is it's gonna get us some funding where we can help continue developing the group, hold workshops, do educational outreach events like this, and formalize some of the decision-making structures and mission statement and goals. And then we'll go into developing a watershed management plan. And that's really a key factor in both describing what our goals are as a community, but also getting access to a lot of other sources of funding. There's a lot of WaterSmart and reclamation programs that require you to have a watershed plan before you can submit for those fundings. And I also know that the NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, also likes them a lot. There's a lot of money you can get through them. And so what we're looking for right now is we would really appreciate it if you could follow this link, complete the survey to kind of help us inform our watershed or preliminary efforts as we apply for this grant. And then if you have any questions or if there's anything else we can do to be of assistance, you can reach out to me at my email here.
You got time for questions, Garland?
Yeah.
All right. Well, first of all, let's give Garland a round of applause. Let's see if we got some questions from the group. John, I'll start with you. I'll put you on the spot. You got any questions for Garland?
I don't have any questions right now.
All right. Well, let's take some hands and see who's got questions, comments. There we go.
Well, one question I had is when you were talking about like the mesquites, has there been any research or study looking at because mesquites are nitrogen fixers, the advantage of taking advantage of that within the nutrient cycle, or is it just kind of like being looked at separately?
Yeah, there has been some work done on that. I believe that Dr. Nabham down at the U of A, he's been looking into like the mesquite encroachment as reframing it as a positive thing and potentially using it as a food source and looking into some of those other benefits. But from my understanding is that benefit isn't significant enough compared to like the effects on the water cycle and everything else, and especially those erosion effects that you get. As mosquito encroachment occurs, right, so you get what a mosquito trunk looks like. It tends to be pretty thick. And so if you go out in the desert and look under a mesquite tree, there's nothing growing under it, right? So all that water that trickles down through the mesquite canopy that doesn't get intercepted, that's just going to go straight onto the ground and turn into runoff and carry soil away. So that's a pretty big concern there.
There's a whole Texas A&M study on the effects of scrub mesquite on the watershed. It's a huge negative effect. Just removing thinning the scrubby growth can have huge benefits for that.
The real trouble though is like once mesquite gets established, it is super labor intensive to take out. Down in Avra Valley, there's another watershed group down there, the Avra Valley Watershed Conservation Alliance. They're all ranchers down there. It's really rural, and so mesquite encroachment is a really big concern for them with their grasslands. They have a bunch of pilot programs that they're evaluating different methods of taking out mesquite, and nothing's really shown a lot of promise so far. So it really does end up being those types of manpower-intensive applications to remove it.
Retreat. You can see it on the fire break. We cut them all last year, and it's already starting to pop back up.
Yeah, a lot of mesquite too. Once you cut it down that first time, it comes back with those giant thumb-sized horns on it too. It's awful.
I had a question on the Hut 12s. What can you tell us about either like where they're at or what marks them from one to another?
Oh yeah, can we go back to that map?
Which one? Keep going. Oh, let's go back. Ah! There we go. Sorry.
No, no worries.
Go over.
Yeah, it's down there 23 maybe? Nope, further down. There, 25. Yeah, so like we were talking about, we set the boundaries of a watershed based on how, like the elevation, how the topography of the land works. So like actually the surface of the land and how water is going to flow over it, right? So if you imagine getting out onto the top of a ridge line, right? Water, if it hits right at that ridge line, it's going to go either right or left. And so that's basically what you do in a really overly elaborate process is you go through and determine where water is going to break within a watershed, and that's how you divide it down farther. So if you guys are able to see here, and maybe when you get it on your own, you can see that all these lines here along the watersheds against the shaded hill slope in the background, you can see they're running along those ridge lines, and so that's how they define them, is because all the water in this region is, like all the water here is going to flow down into this channel. All the water here is going to flow down into this channel. And they keep doing that until they get down to a single outlet point at the edge of the sub-watershed, and that's how they define it.
So where are we? Can you kind of like give us like a just kind of point to about
Yeah,
where
so
we're?
Superior's around right here. So the town of Superior boundary goes through like this region over here. You've got Boyce Thompson over here.
Is the town of Superior in almost like is the whole town in a Hut 12?
I need to double check that. It's either one or two, so it might overlap into this one a little bit, but I can double check that for you later.
The Upper Queen Creek watershed is its own distinct area, but I think it's combined with the lower broader watershed. And all that upper watershed, the headwaters, all gets concentrated in Queen Creek Canyon. So it doesn't widen out until it hits Magna Ridge, really, and then it becomes a much bigger watershed. But the upper watershed is only 22 square miles.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So, but is the upper Queen Creek watershed, is that a collection of 5 Hut 12s?
Oh yeah, so this is also where we get into problems, right? Like, so I don't know if you guys noticed on the previous map, I think there were 3 different watersheds at 3 different hug levels called the Middle Gila. So yeah, the Upper Creek watershed, Upper Queen Creek refers to this, the Hug 10 there, but it could also refer to one of the Hug 12 watersheds in there. I haven't checked all the names on those yet.
I think part of least where I'm interested is because if we could identify where in the town of Superior there's like, we're in one watershed and we're actually in another watershed, knowing that it's all subsumed under the
Oh yeah.
larger.
Oh yeah. So Superior itself is all within the single Hug 10 watershed. It might span over multiple Hug 12s.
Right, and that's the part of like seeing where those, like if we could actually see for ourselves where the
Yeah.
demarcation are.
I can.
Smaller one.
Yeah, I can for sure like throw together a quick map showing that. I wanted to show the flow lines here and didn't want the map to get too crowded.
But that's also our, this map he's showing is our full planning area for this watershed management plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do try to go up, we're going all the way to Queen Valley, all the way to Whitlow Dam, and trying to address those issues for the whole area, because our little basin, the Superior Valley, collects quite a bit of water and concentrates it down into Queen Creek to Queen Valley.
So what's normally the process for a group like this? Like, how does it form? What's the sort of governance, or is that managed by the group itself, or?
Yeah, I mean every group forms in a little different way and with a little different purpose. So the big thing that Reclamation is looking for is that it's sort of a grassroots approach to things. They don't want like ADEQ coming in and saying, we're forming a watershed group and we're doing this. They don't want it to be regulatory. They want it to be participatory and consensus based. They want to make sure that people are working together and cooperating, building on common grounds, and working to improve the watershed in a vision that matches the whole community, not just some aspects of it. And so the process that we're kind of following through here right now is that the Queen Creek Working Group got formed back in 2019, I want to say. And it started off kind of as this grassroots sort of thing with the town of Superior, Arizona Water Company, Boyce Thompson Arboretum, Resolution Copper, and other stakeholders coming together, recognizing that restoration of the riparian areas and perennial flows in Queen Creek is important, starting to work together, sharing information to do that. So this is where I can really nerd out for a while, because this is a large part of my focus of study for my degree, is kind of these dynamics of how these groups form and represent each other. And so as we're going through this, what we're doing now is we're trying to leverage this funding from Reclamation, because it's a pretty good amount of money, and it gives us access to some other resources as well, a broader network of people that'll be able to help us out. And that'll allow us to do things like have workshops where we develop our purpose and mission, hear from the community, and then we'll transition into watershed planning activities. And that's where we really, really get intense on some of these types of workshops and engagement activities, and trying to build that coherent and consensus-based vision of what type of restoration activities we want to pursue here. And so we're working on putting together this grant right now. And so the first step of that is really like doing some of this preliminary outreach work like we've been talking about, talking to different groups in the area, getting their interest. And that's what that survey is a really big factor here, because it gives you guys a say. We started doing some of this preliminary work because that makes Reclamation like your application a lot more. If you can say that, hey, we have all these people participating, they represent these interests within the watershed, we've got a preliminary mission statement, and we've identified some of the concerns in the area, which are all part of that survey. And the more people and the more interest we can show we're reflecting, the more strong our application is going to be. So as we go through the watershed planning process, there's three big functions for a watershed management plan, right? The first is to do a watershed assessment, to kind of lay out what's currently going on in the watershed. What's the state? What are the concerns? What are the issues? The second part of it is kind of like taking that assessment and laying out what specific things you want to address. What are your big concerns? And what is your vision? Like, where do you want to be? What do you want your watershed to function as? Do you want to have a healthy riparian area? Or are you more concerned with preventing flood risks? You know, those are the types of things we'll develop. And then we'll start identifying. Then the next step is to identify those projects that take us from our current state, the current watershed assessment, to that kind of vision statement where we want to be. We select those projects, prioritize them within the plan, and then we can start working on getting funding for doing the detailed design and implementation planning, and getting some funding to do some shovel work on the ground.
So this is some reference for everybody, because before Garland's time, 1998, the town did a similar process. They applied for a Bureau Reclamation grant. They did a whole bunch of study. They wrote a plan. It's still a good plan. It has some good pieces in it that we're pulling out, we're trying to build, but it's too out of date. We have to start over pretty much in order if we're gonna go for the new funding. It's not up to date enough. All that stuff that was considered back then isn't even legal today, so we have to start over.
But another way we're lucky with that though, is that does give us a really good historical baseline to work against and a really good documentation trail. Like working with some other rural areas of the state, you're basically starting from blank paper, and so we're in a really good spot here with how developed the Queen Creek Working Group is already and some of the projects that they've already been able to pursue.
So then, after that plan is created and you're talking about applying for funding, so is there a sponsoring agency or fiduciary agent, or are we trying to create an organization in and of itself to do this, or
Well, yeah. So so the Bureau of Reclamation has a specific definition of what a watershed group is, right? And so the first portion of the grant we're applying for is going to be doing the necessary development work to make sure that the Queen Creek Working Group meets all those definitions of a watershed group for reclamation's purposes, right? At that point, and so these are all like really preliminary things that I'm talking about now that will be decided as part of the actual planning process and group development. A lot of times you see watershed groups through this process become their own like kind of standalone organization where they're their own fiscal agent and have that sort of like nonprofit status. That's a pretty frequent mechanism you see here. And so by having that organization with that like kind of history and the ability to bring those stakeholders together, it really makes you look a lot more competitive with federal agencies and even like private outside like nonprofit funders like the Walton Family Foundation and other groups. Because another key fact about like bringing together and doing this as a consensus basis is the federal government and private donors, they don't want to dump money into a project that's just going to get caught up in court because everyone disagrees about it or they don't have a unified community about it. And so by doing this watershed planning process, we build on common grounds and we build consensus and we all decide what to do together, so that way we show that we have that unified purpose and makes it a lot more desirable for these outside organizations to give us funding.
To answer your question in a more practical way, it's unlikely that a small agency will be able to go for one of the big grants, mainly because they're mostly reimbursement grants. So if it's a $5 million project, you have to be able to sustain that cash flow. So it's going to take deeper pockets than a small nonprofit could do, or even a watershed management group could do. So one of the members of the group would have to agree to be the fiduciary for and handle the money. It's just the way, practically the way it has to be.
And you can do that on a project by project basis. There's all, and so this is like what I'm saying. It's preliminary. We'll decide this as part of the process.
And that's like for instance, we have a coalition of all the Carpet Corridor communities to work on our blight issues. We all have the same blight issues. When we went for the big grants, Gila County took fiduciary out. They are running the grants for us, and they're doing all the filing, they're doing the applications, but the money's available for all the Carpet Corridor communities. And well, that's about $2 million. So, I mean, these things, I mean, the coalitions are much more likely to get funded. Everybody working together, everybody getting along. They cut checks. We applied for a blight grant, an EPA grant, add a loan as a town. We were rejected. The next year, we formed a coalition. We had Gila County write it, and we were funded.
Any other questions?
All right. Going once, going twice. Garland, thank you very much. One more round of applause for Garland. Thank you for coming. Yeah, awesome. So, will you just put your email back up so we have it somewhere?
There's also
Yeah, cool.
It's on the left side there, and also the link.
Nice. All right.
And these presentation will be made available soon, I assume.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can follow the link there.
Cool. Right on. Thanks again, Garland. Thanks for coming, y'all.